All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We have a really exciting hour and a half planned for y'all. So thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. My name is Angie Razzo. I'm Duncan 2016, still based out of Houston. I'm currently the Texas State Director for a civic organization called Mi Familia Vota. Mirna and I really just have been friends since college, and we've continued our conversation about how we want the Hispanic community to thrive, not just at Rice, but also beyond Rice. And since our friendships bloomed at Rice, we've always been in contact. We've both pursued careers, trying to build a better community and future for the Latinx community. And we were just talking a couple of months ago when we were, just chatting about how do we continue this conversation that she and I have on a very passionate level, and how do we share the dialogue with our fellow Rice alum, our current students, Rice affiliates, people outside the Rice community. And we were just thinking, there's so many Rice people doing amazing things in our community, really championing racial equity, social equity, addressing the deep-rooted systemic issues that are occurring in our community that have been happening for generations, and trying to take on that battle. And we wanted to share the work they're doing with y'all, so you guys have a better understanding or can get some insight as to, how does racial equity show up in our professions? What can we do? How can we be individuals within institutions that are pushing for a better tomorrow, for pushing for social and racial equity? So we have a really great lineup for y'all today. Mirna will be moderating our amazing panel. We have 4 individuals who have just a thorough knowledge and will share, a little bit about, through their profession and through their personal lives, why this work is so important to them, how this shows up, and share some of that with y'all. And we also want to include dialogue and conversation at the end. So throughout the panel, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But we're gonna begin with some really great questions. I'm about to throw it off to Mirna, again, who's a personal friend of mine and just someone that I really look up to, who's been a community leader in the state of Texas. And I'm so glad that she's able to lead this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Angie. You're wonderful. And I'm so glad that we can continue having these conversations and working together. My name is Mirna Garza. As Angie mentioned, I graduated from Rice in 2016, a part of Lovett College, got a degree in economics and Spanish. But after graduating and really through the influence of Rice, I realized that I wanted to do a career change and decided to go to higher ed. And I'm currently working at Texas A&M University San Antonio. I'm a coordinator for their Office of First Year Experience, and do a lot of programming and support services for students that are transitioning into the university. And I have found my passion there, and the way that I'm trying to push for equity, and how do we make sure that our spaces in our higher education system are equitable to all of our students. And so I'm really happy to be talking to you all today. As Angie mentioned, this is a conversation that needs to be ongoing. There's so much that we can do on our everyday lives, with the relationships that we have in our careers, to really try and stop these systems and break down these systems that have constantly oppressed our communities. And so I'm glad that we're starting this dialogue, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue, throughout, throughout the next months and years. And so I'm going to get us started with panelist introductions. Fernanda will be sending the bios out in the link. And right now our panelists will be doing short introductions. So let's start with Esteban.
Hi, everyone. My name is Esteban Delgado. I am currently in Austin, Texas, but I am a Rice graduate 2013 from Duncan College. I actually majored in ecology and evolutionary biology when I was at Rice. But I think, getting out and starting to work in the healthcare sphere and becoming more and more thoughtful about what does it mean to really care about people in society, really got interested in issues of public policy. And so I actually went back to school and got my master's in public policy at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin. And through that have kind of made my way into kind of public policy and philanthropy. I currently work at the Austin Community Foundation, where I head up the Hispanic Impact Fund over there, and we're a grant-making institution collective in Central Texas that seeks to empower and bring more resources and opportunities to the Latino community that exists here in Central Texas, that, like many communities across the United States, have been historically oppressed. And so just trying to, do the good work every day to ensure that, people know that our people are here and that we deserve the same opportunities as anyone else, and working together with those in the community that are in leadership to make sure that's possible.
Okay. Olivia, do you want to do your introduction?
Sure, I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Olivia Vargas Perez, and I am a graduate I was in Brown, and I have a degree in psychology. After graduating from Rice, I started working in early childhood intervention out of Baytown. I'm from Baytown, and I went home and started working there. Then I ended up getting married, went to Laredo, was living in Laredo for a couple of years, and then we came back and relocated back to Houston. Started my family and took about a 10-year hiatus out of actually working. Then I decided to go back to graduate school, and I went to the University of Houston Clear Lake, where I got my specialist degree in school psychology and then became a school psychologist. In 2018, I started my own company, which is a special education consulting group, and it's called Identify. And part of what we're doing, our big mission, is trying to identify ways that we can solve some of the big problems that are facing our children right now, not only from like a mental health standpoint, but from an educational standpoint. And so we consult with school districts across the state to help them solve some of the big challenges that I think impact at least my own family and my kids' daily lives.
Thank you, Olivia. We're going to do Jose.
Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Jose Ramirez IV. I am Hanson 2003. I graduated from Rice in 2003 with a degree in English and Spanish. And then I went to law school at Columbia University School of Law in NYC. The bulk of my career was dedicated to immigration law. And then slowly but surely over the course of my career, I started drifting a lot more towards the nonprofit and advocacy sectors of immigration law. So I started doing corporate work, but then I gradually gravitated towards more of the social activism side of things. Most previously, I was a children's program attorney for Raíces based in Austin. I represented undocumented children in state district court and in federal immigration court in deportation proceedings, asylum hearings, things like that. Most recently, I'm the staff attorney now for IDEA Public Schools here in Texas. Sorry. In which I am very happy to be part of the mission of serving underrepresented and underserved communities, mostly kids who are minorities, in closing the educational and achievement gap, because I identify really strongly with communities like that because I am from one. Originally from La Joya, Texas. Happy to be here with you folks tonight.
Thank you, Jose. Happy to have someone else from the Valley. I'm also from the Valley. To our last panelist, Benjamin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Benjamin Hernandez. I graduated in 2005 from Sid Rich. Went back and did my MBA there at the Jones School. Graduated in 2007. During that time, I was working in my last year of my undergrad. I interned at City Hall, and they, a couple of weeks later, I was taking it for credit, and they said, "Hey, do you want to work here?" And I was like, "I need the money, I need the credit." And so I went back to my professor and I was like, "Hey, here's my problem. I'm taking this for credit, the internship, but they just offered me a job." He's like, "You've been there 6 weeks and they offered you a job?" And I was like, "Yeah, I haven't even graduated." He's like, "Don't worry, you get an A. Come back at the end of the semester, I'll sign your stuff." And that was my entry into working in government. It was totally by accident. And I stayed there got my MBA while I was working in government. Like, That was the hardest 2 years I've ever done. You know, I would leave the Jones School, like I had it timed down. There was like 17 minutes from when I left, you know, my desk, my cubicle at City Hall, down, you know, down Fannin, down Main, into the garage and into my seat. I did that for 2 years, got my MBA and continued to work at City Hall. Then I went over to the health department and I, you know, started working there, and I ended up the last 5 years that I was there, I was the chief financial officer for the health department. But then 2016 happened, and for me it was a big wake up. And what I mean, like 2016 happened, the election cycle around 2016 and what I was seeing in the country happened. And for me, I'll tell you more about this later, but long story short, I quit my job, career, salary, corner office, and all of that to basically run for office, to get in a space that I had actively avoided all of my life. I ran as an independent, and in Texas, that's pretty much a suicide mission, right? Actually, anywhere. I got 4% of the vote, and I'm actually rounding up. It was like 3.4% of the vote, but you know, if I round up, I feel a little bit better. But for me, it was about getting into a space that I had not been involved in. And to wrap up where I am now, after running for office, one of the things I started was a firm to do digital advertising to really help political campaigns, small and grassroots political campaigns, because if we were going to change part of our system, we have to change who runs, how they run, and what they do when they get there. So that's what I'm doing now. I run Human Age Digital, and you'll hear more about my story later. Thank you, and it's great seeing you all.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. Before we start with our questions, Angie and I want to be intentional on defining what we meant by racial inequity and really racial equity and social equity. So I'll be sharing a quick 3-slide PowerPoint with some of these definitions. Let me pull that up. Okay.
I think it's so great that you are actually defining this for us, because I think that a lot of times when we have difficulties in conversing, I think that it comes from a misunderstanding of what we're meaning by the words that we choose to utilize.
Yes, it's something that's extremely important. I work with college students, and we've been doing professional development about crucial conversations, and this is one of the big things that we talk about, of how a lot of times there's a lot of meaning that, as you said, that is lost in communication, and that there's a lot of other things like body language and things, and so we just want to make sure that we kind of clear and are specific on what we mean by these things. So first, by racial equity, this is from the Center for Assessment and Policy Development. We mean racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, how one fares. When we use the term, we are thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice, and thus we also include work to address root causes of inequity, not just their manifestation. This includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes, but raise or fail to eliminate them. This is kind of what we're starting with, and really seeing that it's at every level. And I think social equity, this one was a little bit harder to define. I think I was reading through like different articles and research, and everyone kind of had a bit of a different perspective and kind of what this meant. And I decided to go with this definition because Angie and myself are both very passionate about policy and how do we make that type of structural change. And so we wanted to also gear up a couple of our questions do talk about that. And so we felt that this was kind of a good framework for that. And so by social equity, we mean the fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions serving the public directly or by contract, the fair, just, and equitable distribution of public services, and implementation of public policy, and the commitment to promote fairness, justice, and equity in the formation of public policy. So kind of with that in mind, I will stop sharing my screen. And panelists, feel free to integrate any part of these definitions or thoughts about them in this first question. But this first question that I have is specifically for Benjamin and for Esteban. And the question is, you both work with organizations that support other organizations and community providers. How does your work progress racial equity for underrepresented communities?
I'm happy to kind of field this first, and I really appreciate, like Olivia said, kind of the definitions, because I think they're really important, and I'll kind of start there and kind of go into the question a little bit more thoroughly. But something important to kind of know about me is that, I grew up in the Deep South. I'm far away from any other Latinos, and I grew up in Columbia, Tennessee, which is about 40 minutes away from where the KKK was founded. And so I grew up in a very kind of white-centric background, and the thing that was kind of hammered into my head, growing up that way, is that there were certain things that I wasn't supposed to be able to do, and one of them was, when I said I wanted to go to college, and when I wanted to go to Rice, and as I kind of think back on that, in my mind, as we're little, a lot of us are told, like, go get an education. That is your ticket out of poverty. It's your ticket out of your current situation. It's your ticket right into success. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time at Rice. But as I look back on it, I definitely wanted to align myself with an institution like Rice, because I saw the power, right, that it could give me as a person. Right, it would align me with the power structures, the white power structures that I was fed to believe are success. And as I graduated from Rice and kind of started down my professional career and path, I very quickly recognized that I lived in a bubble. And my mom was very quick to point out this bubble. She was like, you think you're so smart, but sometimes you need to get out of this world that you've built for yourself and figure out how you can really kind of bring these things back to the community. A community that maybe has not always been kind to you, but a community nonetheless that deserves your attention. And I think it was kind of around the same time of leaving Rice that I was really kind of starting to become very passionate about my Latino identity, and recognizing that I was lucky in the sense that a lot of us in our community try really hard, but the opportunities become less and less as we become infringed upon because of structural inequities. And so coming back to your question, one of the things that I do in working in philanthropy is we try to bridge the divide that's left by government, right? Government can't do all things, nor does government try to do all things at this time because of who's currently in power. And another part of that is a lot of the power in making change is centered in white spaces. So I work at a community foundation. I work at a foundation. Those foundations are white-centered, white-led. But I have the honor and privilege of working at a community foundation that has said racial equity is an issue we want to take on. And so it's coming into that space and forcing them to say, okay, if racial equity is the issue we want to take on, let's ensure that we are giving that social equity across the board to everywhere we decide to give funds. And so for us in this work, what does that look like? It means let's stop giving money to organizations that are white-led that want to serve Latinos. Let's fund Latinos. Let's fund the people that look like us because they need the capacity, to do this work. Let's fund people that look like us because they have the solutions. And unfortunately, a big part of that is also in educating our white peers to let them know that, like, hey, we're willing to take this on, just give us the opportunity. And so to kind of sum this up, I think a big part of this is recognizing that we are going to, regardless of who's in power, regardless of where the politics sway, we are going to be in the same situation of trying to claw our way out of the systemic inequities that we face unless we are champions for this work, regardless of what field we work in, and ensuring that we help build capacity and lift up those that come after us to ensure that we're working together, and that we're using our voice and that we're not staying silent, or being, right, the good Latinos that the white people want us to be. So I'll leave it there.
In 2000, in the year 2000, when I graduated from high school, I asked my friends, and I was like, hey, what's a good school to go to? This is May of 2000. And one of my friends was like, Rice. I was like, oh, cool. I grew up in South Houston. I was like, great. So I started to look it up, and then I was like trying to apply to get into Rice. And of course, we know that I was too late, about 8 months too late. So that was like a real introduction into like the real world, because my school didn't have the counselors that kind of told you should apply ahead of time and do all that kind of thing. After 3 years at Rice, in 2004, I started out, and my parents were going through a divorce, and I had to basically, I didn't have money to pay for school, and I had to drop out of Rice. This was my senior year, like 2 months into my senior year. I had to drop out. I couldn't pay for school. I started a housekeeping company, to serve all the graduate students and medical center workers, and like cleaning apartments in the med center area. And about a year later after that, a little old lady from church says, hey, weren't you going to Rice? And I was like, yeah. I was like, but I couldn't pay for school. She's like, nah, you got to go talk to Dr. Camacho. He's the vice provost of student affairs. I was like, okay, I didn't know what a provost was. I didn't know what a vice provost was. This was 3 years after being at Rice. So I did. I went to talk to Dr. Camacho, and Dr. Camacho was like, he interrupted my story, which was really a good story, about like a sad story about how I need to get back into school and like my parents' divorce and all that. He said, so you need to get back in. And I was like, yeah. He said, hang on. Picked up the phone, called somebody, and then said, okay, go see so-and-so, over there in financial aid. So I walked over there. They were asking me some questions. She printed out a sheet of paper, and she said, okay, here, go get enrolled. And I looked at it. It was like a scholarship, right? And grants and other stuff. And I was like, what? It was that easy? I spent a whole year? What I learned from that is I didn't know how the systems worked, right? I didn't know you could go talk to somebody. I didn't know you had to, if you had connections or you knew who to talk to, you can get what you need done, even after being in Rice 3 years. And I think that has really just like been etched in my brain, because that's things that I didn't learn. Like I didn't know that Rice was a good school, right? I didn't know there were other good schools better than Rice. But it's because I grew up in a system, I grew up in South Houston, city of South Houston. I went to South Houston Elementary, South Houston Middle School, South Houston High School. And I didn't know these things. And I think a lot of us in some way could probably relate to this, or, some people, or even our own experiences. But what I'm getting to is like, I think what that left me was a big desire to look at the systems and really challenge, and especially the things, that are going to get us to racial equity. And I think racial equity is really a destructive work. It is a work of destructing the systems of oppression, right? So if we really want to achieve racial equity, we have to tear down the things that lead to inequity. And so what I do in my work is like really, really focused, is working with grassroots organizations, people who are running for office, or organizations that don't have, a ton of money to hire DC consultants or East Coast or West Coast consultants to do digital advertising and political campaigning. We are really focused on the grassroots people, like, the activist that wants to run for office, the organization that, puts their money into Black and brown power here in Texas. Those are the people that we want to help, because that's where the help is needed. And I'm proud to do that every day, because I see it, like the more the work that we do, the more that we need to continue doing it. So I went over my time, but I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, both of you. I think one of the things that stood out, I think, for both of your responses was this idea of an action, having the passion, but doing something about it. And I think that's something that's really important, and that I know personally for me, Rice was really key. I was very shy and very quiet growing up. And so I think it gave me that like, oh, like your voice does matter, like, you know, and and so I think it's important for us to kind of have the follow through. And so that actually leads really well with our next question for Olivia and Jose, which kind of focus a little bit more on like, you know, the action side of things. Your role allows you to work directly with community members from disenfranchised backgrounds. How does the lack of racial equity impact the community you serve? How does this impact the everyday lives of the people that you serve?
I can take that. I'll start if Jose doesn't mind. So it's obviously, I mean, working in mental health, I think that it's pretty obvious that racial inequities impact the work that I do on a daily basis. However, I think it's also important to recognize, and even going off of what Benjamin said, one, I appreciate the honesty with which you spoke, because I feel like your experience is one that is kind of the silent experience that so many students at Rice actually do experience. I know that I had similar circumstances where I didn't know how to navigate the system, and I didn't know how to advocate and be a voice for myself, whereas whenever I was in high school, I feel like I probably would have had that self-confidence. But going into a university like Rice, I really lost that voice. And so it's funny because I think it brings me to sort of like why I was even hesitant to join this panel today. Whenever I read the description about the panel, and this is not to be it's not meant to be like a knock on whoever came up with the title or whatever, but I think it's important for us to recognize that we ourselves tend to create our own microaggressions. And if I'm sure all of you have heard the term microaggression, if some of you haven't heard the term microaggression, it's basically the idea that white is right, and so anything that we're looking at is being viewed through the lens of what white society has placed on us. And so whenever you even said, like, the title of this talk is Concept of Leveraging Our Degrees in Our Profession, I think if we're ever going to get to the point of racial justice and social justice, one, we have to recognize that it's our duty in the work that we do as professionals to recognize that in the communities that we serve, we are coming from a space of privilege. I think all of us probably have family members that we can think of who have been so instrumental in our success, who didn't have that privilege to study. One, to even study at a university like Rice, but even to maybe even finish high school. So even just finishing high school, I think, is a huge privilege that we have to acknowledge. And if we ever want to make it to the point of racial equity, what we have to recognize is that it shouldn't take a degree or my degree from Rice is just as valuable, in my opinion, as somebody who finished high school, as somebody who went to a trade school, as somebody who, maybe has some fancy initials after their name and they're called doctor. Okay, great. I'm glad that you were able to achieve that, but your voice is just as important as the person who didn't have that opportunity to, we need to listen to them, and only whenever everybody is actually listened to and respected and their opinion is valued, and they don't have to say, well, my opinion matters because I have XYZ initials after my name, then only then will we have racial equity.
Yeah, and so I can speak to this a little bit, just sort of in my own context and career, but in terms of the lack of racial equity affecting or directly affecting community members of disenfranchised people whom I work with, I mean, obviously this had a lot of bearing on what I did previously, but even now, I guess the lack of representation in presence of kids who come from communities such as this is the kind of obvious big one, right? Especially at the higher education level, and furthermore, especially even with kids who wind up getting to that level, but then wind up actually finishing and getting a degree. right? And so that's kind of that's something that is it's a known issue, and it's a known constant, and it's something that we as an organization, obviously, and many others like us, are continuously striving for. I would add to this that I feel something that's a little more insidious and overlooked is the lack of organizational representation. Because depending on what kind of organizational representation is there or not there, if it is not reflective of the community that it is meant to be serving, then it can often be actively harming the particular demographic that it's trying to serve, even while doing so with maybe even the best of intentions. And so when you have people who are at the decision-making level, who are there more or less as a result of their income or their degrees or their prestige, or which oftentimes correlate or overlap pretty significantly with their social and their personal and professional connections, then that racial inequity can continue to be perpetuated, because many of the prevalent issues that our students and their communities are contending with are actually being assessed through this faulty lens that doesn't really apply to them, right? And so what I mean by that is whether that lens that's being used is being used because of the biases, these internal sort of subconscious biases that the decision makers might have, or maybe because of notions they might harbor about race or socioeconomic status. It doesn't really matter, because there's no institutional check, there's no organizational check on beliefs that might be uninformed or bigoted or borderline racist even. And so therefore these fixes for these very legitimate problems wind up hurting the students and their communities a lot more, because there's little to no room for any kind of meaningful reassessment of what might have gone wrong and how can we fix this moving forward. And so it's obviously a systemic problem. It's not just education. Obviously, this is just across the professional spectrum. But for my part, I can confirm that we're being very proactive in addressing what are very large and complicated problems from within. And we're being very aggressive in terms of trying to view these problems through the appropriate community-oriented and connected lenses.
Thank you all. And I think it was really neat how there was kind of the connection between, even though there was a slightly different question, there was this connection. And I saw it with Esteban mentioning, like, hey, like, we need to give the money to the actual communities and actually people that want to do that work. And with Jose, of like, we need to understand the students, and we need to have more of that, people that actually understand the communities that we're serving. And I think that's a very important thing to have. Olivia, thank you so much for making that point. I think it's something that Angie and I actually talked about that last night, where we were pushed to see that the success, and Esteban mentioned this earlier, like the success means, getting that degree from this like great institution, or, from that Ivy League school or whatever this is. But that doesn't give you more power than someone. Everyone should have that same voice. And thank you so much for sharing that and pointing that out, because I think it's really important. It's something that, as for Rice students and now for us alumni and community members, we need to be more aware of that everyone's voices really matter, and that you shouldn't have that degree to be able to make the change and be heard. For this next question, we're going to move, it's going to be for all of our panelists, and we're going to focus specifically on your professions and how you see your colleagues and the systems that you're in contributing to racial inequity. We could say being complicit. And so we'd love to hear a little bit about that and how you see this in your fields.
I guess I can kind of kick us off on this one. I think this is a really interesting question, especially as we live through a time of COVID-19 and the magnification that it's had of magnifying, right, the racial inequities that have been around for a very long time. And so I think we see two things at play, right? We see there's an appetite at the moment for our perspectives to be highlighted. I feel like, the day after the death of Ahmaud Arbery, I woke up and had like 7 different invites from organizations in my community to serve on their boards. And it's like, oh, this is really interesting, right? Like, never heard of you before. All of a sudden you want my perspective, you want my input. And a few of them I accepted, because I was like, this could be an opportunity to get into these spaces and to enact change or to really push them. A lot of these invites that I've gotten from white leaders have been like, we would love to have your perspective, right, to help us kind of shift and change things. And as I've taken on some of these roles, and as we've gotten maybe away from some of the news cycle of the murders of Black individuals in our communities, it's really interesting to see how one minute they want your, current structures want to bring you into the fold, but then don't want to listen to you or don't want to really accept what you're telling them as issues in the community and want to be combative. And it can be kind of disheartening. And especially as we look at our communities and we see that our perspectives are being shifted and pushed more to the fringes, quite literally. Here in Austin, we see, a lot of Black and brown individuals are being pushed way outside of the city center. So even if you are an institution that wants to serve Black and brown people, and you're located downtown, it's very rare that you're actually it's rare that you're in proximity to the people that you're trying to serve. And so, and I think this is also reflected in our government. Look at the data around who's dying currently, right? It's people that look like us during this pandemic because society has said it's people that look like you that have to work in public spaces right now. It's people that look like you or that look like me and a lot of people here on this panel today that need to do the work that's going to pave the way for our nation's recovery, right, from this pandemic and from the economic fallout from it. And so it's really interesting to kind of see those things become very apparent. But yet when people say we want to do work, we want to do things that are going to uplift the community, that are going to, fight back and change these demographics, that when push comes to shove, right, when the community makes concerted efforts to say, hey, this is what we need, right, in order to survive this, or these are where the issues come. I have community members telling me, like they don't have access to internet, so they can't do the educational work that's needed for their kids right now. Or they don't have Wi-Fi, and so they're having to take their kids or take their work outside of Starbucks in the evening. I'm having, people telling me from the undocumented community that like, hey, we're really struggling because we didn't get that, fiscal stimulus check. We still have bills to pay like everyone else, but we have no help. And yet we're like, what, almost 30 weeks into this, over 6 months, and we know the data surrounding what's happening right now, and yet none of our leaders have come up with the innovative approach to actually listening to people, to say, hey, we're going to listen and we're going to do what you're telling us to do. And it goes back to, we're waiting for the people that are in leadership, or the people that have degrees, the doctors, to say this is what we need to do to be successful in warding off what's happening right now. But in actuality, all it would really take is for people to get off their high horse and to say, no, I'm actually going to go listen to the community right now because they have the answers. And so that's really hard to see. It's really hard to see people say, yes, come in. We've lacked the perspective of people that looked like you for forever, and we finally want to integrate this into what we're doing. But then once that kind of maybe vigor subsides, people kind of falling back into old habits. And I think that's where it's our mission and opportunity to hold people accountable, and maybe to step out and make ourselves uncomfortable and say, hey, this isn't what we're going to really stand for right now.
Steven, I think that is a really great, what you brought up here, especially towards the end of what you were saying. I feel like you brought up a really good point as to kind of what my personal reason was for starting my own company. I think that we far too often tend to wait for people to tell us what we should do instead of just doing what we know we should do. It's like we are stuck in a position of constantly asking for permission instead of just doing what we know is right, and that we don't need permission to live our lives and to create our own reality. And so whenever we talk about people being in positions of power and how can we make them, be in tune with the communities that they're serving, I think that it's important to bring up to their faces like the everyday realities of the communities that we're working with, because I think that right now, especially with the current political climate, I think everything has become politicized, and I think that it's really hurt our community and the progress that we're making in the world, because whenever we have created social norms that basically prohibit us from talking about anything real, progress isn't made, and you're forgetting about the people that you're serving. So, it makes me think back to whenever I was in graduate school, and this isn't, racial justice, but for me, it's just humanity. I remember being in graduate school, and I was doing coursework on school psychology. And so you would think that you would go into school and anything that's going on in terms of current events would actually be discussed. And I remember going in, and it was the day, I think it was after, I can't remember if it was Newtown, the shooting where all of the first graders were so tragically killed. But I, as a parent and as somebody who was studying that, I remember feeling extremely out of sorts, and that I wasn't going to know how to deal with that and deal with the trauma that my own parents that I work with, that they were experiencing. I know we were all scared to send our kids back to school. And I remember our professor didn't even bring it up. And I was like, whoa. And I raised my hand and I was like, are we really going to have this class and not talk about what just happened today? And I remember the teacher kind of being like, whoa, she was not expecting that conversation to come up. And I was just like, how are you not going to talk about this? And so she was like, yes, let's all take a moment of silence, to pray for these people and stuff. And I'm like, no. We're literally being trained to be the people who are going to go in and provide those comforting words, and we can't even talk about it amongst ourselves. No, life happens, and we've got to learn to speak about the hard things. And so I think that whenever, it's kind of like this meeting right now, right? As I was getting ready for this meeting, the news broke that Breonna Taylor didn't receive the justice that I feel that she deserved. And so I think it's important for us all here to say her name, because Black Lives Matter, and we can't ignore the current events that are affecting, and they're the undertone and the undercurrent of our educational system. They're the undertone of the things that are being talked about in our families' lives every single day. And whenever you go into societies, yes, we want to create spaces where people can learn, but at the same time, we have to recognize and be conscientious that we're going to be sensitive to the things that are actually impacting their lives, because it matters. And whenever you're a child and you see that the person who looks like you can be killed in their house, and then there's not going to be any consequence, well, it makes you question like your own worth. And that's something that we have to work against actively, and speak out against, and stop having these creating these environments in our work where we're only allowed to talk about certain things. No, we need to keep it real, and we need to talk about what the real world is talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I think that being actively involved in the conversation is so critical to really bringing equity. And here's what I mean, is that I can start by saying that I was complicit, right? And in a lot of ways, I'm still complicit. Here's what I mean by that. Being this undocumented kid from Mexico who grew up in Taco Town, South Houston Elementary, South Houston Middle School, South Houston High School, great. I made it to Rice, got an MBA, was the CFO, corner office, six-figure salary. But then I look back and I was like, it took a monumental shift in sort of what was happening in the country for me to be like, yo, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing, right? And that for me was really having to leave everything I was doing at that point and do the uncomfortable thing. I hated politics, y'all. I was like, politics, parties, yup. Like, I don't like that stuff. But if I was going to do something, I had to get in that space. And y'all, it was hella hard to like quit your job, not have health insurance, right? And go through all of those scary things and not having an income, because I was like, damn, if we're going to like change the system, I need to do something because I'm not seeing anything about it. And in a way, I guess what I'm saying is that if we think about it for a minute, we may all be a little bit complicit. Here's what I mean. Even I'm just going to take my example. So now I'm doing work, over this past couple of years to help grassroots organizations, grassroots candidates, activists run for office and get involved in a system that no space has been created. But after about 2 years or 3 years of doing this, 2.5 years of doing it, I'm really good at it, right? And then I'm like, well, duh, that's what I should be doing, right? I'm already involved in this space. And then the question to me is like, what else do I need to be doing beyond this, right? I'm actively involved in the work, but I need to ask myself, what else do I need to do? Because when you're looking at racial inequity, like that means that we are behind. And if we are going to get ahead, we have to do the extra work. And so the question that I'd ask all of us to reflect on is like, great, even the ones that are involved in this space actively, that's really good. But what else are we doing? Because we have a lot of catching up to do. And that's really hard and scary, right? And everybody, we all have our own answers to whatever that, question is and how you answer that yourself. But I just like reflect on myself and I'm like, yeah, this is the work I should be doing. But what else do I need to do? Because when I look at that horizon of things that are happening that we see in our country every single day, hell, even going at the pace that I'm going at, we're never going to catch up, right? And that's a really uncomfortable thing and a really hard thing. We all have things to worry about, and they're real. I'm not saying they're not real, but I do think that we're not going to catch up, or we're not going to achieve this racial equity that we're talking about right now until we're like not only doing what we're doing, but we're doing the extra, and not just us, but other people around us in our communities and our systems and our structures, which we'll talk about more. And I'll leave you with that. It's just, it's not an easy thing, but I do want us to like reflect on that. And again, I start that with myself saying, I was complicit and I am complicit still, right?
I can jump in now if it's okay. So, with respect to systems, systems like, and again, I'm just pulling from my own experience, but systems like school districts, boards of directors, donors, punitive criminal and immigration systems, etc., they're already fertile ground for inequity to grow and multiply and breed, because they're not specifically designed to address these differences at all, right? They're punitive or they're counterproductive, and so they're instead just organized in such a way that tends to help people who don't really need help to begin with. So people who are financially stable or politically connected or who are citizens or cisgendered or whatever, right? People who are already part of the franchise in one way or another, who don't really require the assistance or the guidance necessary to navigate these systems that we all have the misfortune of needing to navigate. On the ground level, I will say that I don't see a ton of colleagues, people at the ground level or the operational level, who are contributing to racial inequity. And this may just be a result of the fields that I've worked in my professional career, immigration advocacy and education. But really, I haven't even really seen it much at the policy level. I've really only seen this in either field, in kind of upper management. And it's always been a result of this sort of disconnect, whether it's intentional or not, between the decision makers and the cause or the community that they're supposed to be serving. So when there's no cultural or experiential connection, when there's this disconnect between what the problems are, what they really are, and what you think they are, then nothing is really being done to address racial inequity, and you're actually harming the overall mission by kind of muddying the message. Or when public perception as a decision maker is actually what's more important to you than achieving actual tangible objectives, then that, in my opinion and in my experience, has always been counterproductive to achieving or to closing the equity gap. And again, in my experience, it actively prevents people from closing that gap, which obviously is a very real impediment to their health and their safety in this country.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all. Made some really important points, and I think something that really stood out to me was the uncomfortableness and understanding that we all have some certain privileges, and especially with seeing like everything that's going on with the Black community and the police brutality, and many of the cases, like Breonna Taylor's and so many more names, and asking ourselves, and I think that's part of the conversation of how do we look inside so that we can then look in the outside. And I think it's something that kind of needs to go hand in hand to be able to create this change and to be able to address the policies, to be able to address the management, and are you really connecting with the community you're serving, and all of these different things. So I have a couple of questions more to ask, but we are getting closer to the time we have left for Q&As, and so I want to give that space first and see if anyone from our attendees has any specific questions they want to ask our panelists, and we can send those questions through the chat, and then if we have an extra time, we can kind of go back to some of the last questions. But yes, if you have any questions, please send them through the chat. I think this is a great question. So what are some opportunities for us to get involved with your organizations? And then we will move to Sophia's question.
So I don't have a specific organization. My company isn't a nonprofit or anything like that, but what we focus on is special education. But I can tell you, just as a parent, speaking as a parent, I think that we need to get involved in our anything that has to do with your schools that provide education in your local communities. I think that's where you can easily start and how to get involved in different organizations. I think serving on your PTA, your parent-teacher organization, I think that's a very, very great place where you can actively make a difference in the lives of your children by supporting their teachers. I think it's become very, very evident the huge inequities, financial inequities, social inequities, everything that's going on right now with the kids that we have who don't have access to internet, kids who don't have access to books, kids whose parents don't speak English. And it's not just Spanish. I mean, we've got in Houston, I think in the school district where my kids attend school, I think we have something like over 57 languages spoken in the households. And so you can imagine just how difficult that type of communication might be. And now parents are having to take on the ownership of educating their own children when they themselves may not even have had a solid foundation from which they can go off of. So I think that's one way that you can get involved in different organizations. And then the other way is, today is National Voting Day. And I think that we need to remember that voting matters. Voting is something that, and I think people think, it's president. I'm going to vote for the president, but it's not going to make a difference. Well, our biggest place where we can actually make a difference is whenever you look into who is on your school board, because the school board is probably what's going to affect, any parent most. And we have to learn, a lot of people don't even realize that their school board members are actually volunteers. I think the majority of school board members actually don't even have children in the school districts that they're serving, they're just community members. So if you think about who might be on a school board, they're likely to be somebody who's very, very privileged, somebody who's retired because they have time and now they can attend all of these meetings and do all the important work that they do and not have to take a salary for it. So that in and of itself, I think we need to pay closer attention to who we're electing to make the decisions about our children, and particularly where those funds are going to get funneled so that we can use those funds in the most effective way.
I can add to that. I think that that is an excellent point, and especially in the space that we work in, right, is to get involved in the system, right, to exercise your right to vote, to know who your, you know, elected leaders are, get involved in that. But I also want to like give you a twist on that, which goes to me. So when people ask me, how can we get involved in the organizations or in our work or what we do? I mean, when I think of like, think in your organizations, if you're like in an organization that's trying to make the world a better place, if you just like follow that thread of what's making the world a not so good place, just keep following it, keep pulling it, keep pulling it. Eventually, you are going to end up with some policymaker or some elected official that sort of gets in the way of what you are trying to do. And we're all fighting these things in our systems, in our organizations, our companies, our structure. We're all fighting it. What I don't see enough of, though, is of us saying, hey, you know what? I'm not only going to vote for these people, hell, I'm going to go run for this seat, right? And I think that's a change that we have to make, because we're all, it's kind of the same side of that coin. We're all looking for somebody else that is like, yeah, look, I'll give you money, I'll support you, I'll go to your event. But very few of us are saying, you know what? Hell, I'm going to run. I can do that job, right? It's the same thing we're talking about in a different dimension. Why don't we think of ourselves as people that can make those changes? Because you know what? Somebody is going to go and do it. And more often than not in our space and what we have seen in our country, it's going to be a white man, right? Like we see changes of that happening, but I'm just saying, it's like, why don't we ask ourselves, like, why don't I do that? I can do it. Probably everybody on this call can do it at any level, right? I don't care if it's your like homeowners association, your school board, city council, mayor, you know, state rep, whatever it is, but we can do it. And we, until we start to think that way, we're always going to be in this, oh, this is somebody else's problem. And I, you know, don't get caught in that thing that like, you know, yeah, I'll give money and I'll support. Well, that's good. Congratulations. If you're making a lot of money, that's the minimum I expect of you, right? I'm saying, what else can we do?
And I can speak really quickly to Norma Santamaria's question about the grassroots organizing, just because specifically, I was coming from Raíces, which actually literally itself found itself in this situation. But in my experience, it's not really an organizational problem, right? When it comes to these kinds of nonprofit organizations that maybe previously didn't have much of a national presence, oftentimes it is very literally a funding problem, right? So they have all of these very, and not just Raíces, but many different organizations in different fields, immigration, education, criminal reform, criminal justice, etc. They are very clear-eyed about what they want to do, what they want to tackle, how they want to go about doing it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even if they're small to begin with and they come into some funding, the nature of these organizations is such that they're extremely flexible. And so if they need to organize up, they can do it very quickly. And in my experience, do it very effectively in terms of hiring motivated, high quality people who are passionate about what they do and who are good at what they do, whatever that might be in terms of achieving the objective of the mission. So, what I would say to this is, it's not so much a narrowing thing, right? So to the extent that you can support any of these organizations in terms of connecting them to sources of fundings or people who might be interested in helping them sort of expand what it is that they do, that really is where the need is. And so, you have examples like Raíces or Kind or Clinic or Forward.us or whatever that are, very progressive organizations who have very clear missions, and they are very well organized nationally. And now, with social media and all of that, this connectivity and this instant nature of being able to sort of organize in a much more effective national way on the drop of a dime, it actually these organizations are well versed in this kind of thing. And so I feel that is where more of the issue lies, right? It's just a matter of give them what they need in order to do what they need to do, because they already know what they want to do. They just need the ability to be able to do it.
I have a few thoughts kind of on these topics as well. In terms of, figuring out how to get involved, I think everyone on this panel, right, is probably very successful, like, having gone to Rice, and very passionate. And I think going back to kind of what Benjamin kind of had said about not doing the bare minimum. So I think it's utilizing where we're at, where we want to be, and ensuring that we, let's say you're not in the current position you want to be, figuring out, okay, what are the steps then that I need to take to get into the field where I can have the most impact? Let's say you're already in that field, right? Figuring out how do you align yourself, right, with the main thinkers at your organization, to challenge them, right, and to make the leaders of that organization uncomfortable. I think that's very similar to the work that we all can be doing as we think about and maybe become a little complacent with the election, or feeling kind of maybe really sad about where the direction things are going, right? Let's not replicate, the white tears of our white neighbors. Let's, figure out what is it that makes us uncomfortable about this situation, right? What do you need to learn about yourself, about why does this make you feel uncomfortable currently? And taking that and being like, okay, I can sit with this, but only if I do these actions, right? And it's figuring out then, okay, what is the action that's going to get me, right, feeling like I'm having an impact? I think it's really easy for us to go around and tell our neighbors what makes us feel like we're being, successful in our pursuits, but it's different for everyone. And there's so many issues out there that need a champion like you, right, in the midst of taking those things on, that I would say it's really personal work. And I think and sometimes it's a cop-out to kind of replicate and follow someone else's path. You are your own person with your own experiences and your own identity, right? Really dig into that. What has that meant to you? What does that mean for where we're at currently? And how can you utilize your experiences and the things that you have expertise in to have the most impact? Because that's the only way that you're going to be able to, at the end of the day, or at least that's the only way at the end of the day I'm able to say, okay, I did what I needed to do. And then in terms of nonprofits, and I feel like I have a slightly different perspective on this because I do work with a funding organization. It's that a lot of the times there's money out there, but given the question, I think sometimes funding for organizations that maybe are perceived to lack capacity isn't given. And it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. It's like, oh, do we give money to an organization to gain that capacity? It's like, no, there are a lot of amazing community groups that are working to challenge, right, the priorities of philanthropy. And I would say, and this is something that I am very passionate about, because I see philanthropy as being an opportunity to drive some of these gaps that government doesn't meet. But if you become kind of, if philanthropy is your jam and that's where you want to have your impact, I would say really, force these white institutions to rethink where they're giving money. They might be giving money to an organization like Raíces that's doing similar work, but led by people that don't represent, right, the community. And so it's going to them and saying, hey, why are you investing your money in dollars over here when you can be investing in an organization that actually reflects the community? And it's thinking about how we can bring these conversations to play in what we do. And recognizing that just because we're being combative or maybe we're making people uncomfortable doesn't mean that that's bad, right? We live in a society where I think we all want to be chipper and happy and not create any issues. But I think one of the things that we can do better is recognizing that just because we become in conflict with one another doesn't mean that we hate each other, or doesn't mean that we can't work with one another. I think most of us will take conflict and we'll reflect on it and see how we can incorporate that into our personal views and make ourselves stronger and better.
So I know that Sophia Androga had a question. I don't know if you wanted to unmute yourself, Sophia, and share that question.
Yeah.
Or send it in the chat.
Yeah, Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I just, quite frankly, not so much of a question, but an observation and really a congratulations to all of you. I'm significantly more seasoned, for lack of a better term, in terms of age than most of you. I can't believe I graduated from Rice in '88. I was in preparation for this conversation. I looked back at just kind of my trajectory in the space of Rice. And I'm one of the founding members of Solar. I remember giving the vision speech to students in 2005. I had the luxury of assisting with David Medina, a complete rock star at Rice, with a centennial, and creating the Hispanic Gala in a video that I will say as follows. I actually, my husband and I and a few others funded to try to make sure that the life experience of Hispanics was referenced. And I'm embarrassed to say I don't have handy the link, but perhaps at some point I can get it. Probably David still has. But really, I just wanted to thank, as I heard these stories, I was so honored to have heard them and appreciate. And if there was a commonality, it was a lot of grind, a lot of grit, which really is one of my favorite words. The prospect of being able to have the preparation, the perspiration, and the tenacity that it takes, but over a prolonged period of time. And that's what everybody on this call has epitomized. We all have very different stories. I immigrant, came here. My father was on a World Health Organization grant, making $5,400 a year for 5 children and my parents, which it was a long time ago, 40 years ago, but it still was not a significant amount of money. We all have an absolute path. And just really, I just thought of grind, grit, and gravitas. Because in your own way, the amount that you've delivered and the imprimatur was just really impressive. And thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts. The only other is, I want to thank you because you made me really ponder about some of the things I didn't have the luxury of doing because I did not know any better. Referencing to Olivia's point about the silence, or Benjamin's, that it finally took that discussion with the provost. I was Phi Beta Kappa, but I didn't know what it was. I was asked to apply for a Fulbright scholarship, but didn't because I didn't know what it was. We all have our own moments where we wish we would have known. So it's really, thank you for giving me the floor. It's really just an inordinate pride to say, really, thank you for all that you guys have done. You guys, gender neutral, I learned to speak English in Boston. But let's stay in the game. Let's, if not the face of power, as diverse as it appears on this screen, will never change. But the commonality among all of us is the pride that we have in being Hispanics and the Rice Common. Obviously, I could have said this in Spanish, pero obviamente un orgullo. Aprecio mucho estas oportunidades y gran saludo, fuerte abrazo, y juntos podemos lograr más si se puede, pero con energía porque la lucha continúa.
Thank you, Sophia, for sharing those words. And yes, thank you so much for our panelists for sharing their experiences and the amazing work that they've been doing, and kind of like also the part of the self-reflection and seeing, how we can continue pushing ourselves and, continue, doing that work. We do have about 10 more minutes. So anyone have any other questions?
I thought I'd like to share, I think Rice is also in its own place at dealing with this and in their own journey, right? We all have journeys in terms of how we come to terms with our racial history and our racial past and what that means to us. And so I would say, being part of this amazing institution, if Rice is where you want to get involved, feel free to reach out. I recently started on the Association of Rice Alumni Board, and we're actively looking to ensure that we can really come to terms with the past that Rice has in this area, and we'll be starting a diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice task force to kind of take this on and get the perspectives of alumni and current students. So I'd love to hear from you. And my only other thought is, as we think about social justice and social equity, and one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the term Latinx that I've really come to embody and like. And the reason why I bring it up is that there are a lot of people, even within our own community, that are on the fringes. There are issues in the disability community. There are issues in the queer community. There are issues right all across these intersectionalities that intersect with being a Latino, with being a Hispanic, with being Latinx. And I would say I think it's really important as we move forward together that we recognize the joint and connected struggles that we have with people that share our heritage, but also are part of other minority groups, and figuring out how we can be a great ally to them. And I would say the same exists, going to Olivia's point with the Black community as well. There's no reason for us to work in silos. Let's work together and let's figure out where our place in that is, so that we're not all pushing in the same manner, but pushing from multiple different directions to ensure that we're being able to take each step forward on the path that we're on.
And I can jump in here too. I see that Brian Najera had a question about advice for graduating students who are looking to prioritize addressing the racial inequity. And I would say, based on my own experience, the nonprofit and the public advocacy sector is always a really good place to start. It's always going to have room for talented people who are motivated and who are really interested in making a difference. Admittedly, I'm not sure how the pandemic may or may not have affected hiring in that particular sector, but there's always organizing to do. There's always a hand to lend. And I don't see why doing it remotely for the time being would make a difference in terms of you being able to find really interesting and meaningful work and being able to contribute, really substantively right away.
I agree, Jose. I think people tend to forget also that it doesn't matter whether we're in a pandemic or we're not in a pandemic. I am a true believer in the concept that we create our own reality. So when we're thinking about a career path, I think that it's important for people to recognize that you can literally create your own career path. So maybe you need to work at McDonald's because you've literally got bills to pay, but at the same time, you might be able to put in a couple of hours for free. Let's say a company can't, pay you, but that you would be a valuable asset to that team or that organization. Call them, literally cold call them. And I'm not joking, and offer your services, and they will take you up on your offer. And then once you make your presence known and you make what you are able to achieve and accomplish known, I promise you the results will fall into place.
Yeah, I think that's really important. How do we make sure that we make space for ourselves when we're in a system that many times has not created space for Latinx, identifying individuals or anyone else from minoritized communities? And so I think that's a great set of advice. I kind of want to add to that question as well, because I think I in my time as I was finishing Rice, economics majors usually went into consulting, and that was the work. And I had to have that hard conversation with myself that maybe I wasn't going to have the salary that I was hoping, or had to leave this dream or being this businesswoman that I was going to be. But I think once I was able to kind of process that, I was like, no, I want to do work that helps the community, that pushes me, that makes me uncomfortable. And I think sometimes it can start with that, having that internal reflection of what is this next step that I want to take. But I want to give another 5-7 minutes for any other remarks. Anyone want to share anything? Any other questions? And then we have a couple of just announcements that we want to do before we finish this call.
One area that this isn't something that we've practiced at all or anything, but I wanted to kind of touch back on Esteban's point about what I think he's getting at. It's funny that you use the term Latinx. And I think I'm kind of like Sophia in the sense that I feel a little bit removed from Rice, right? It's been 20 years since I've graduated. And so that's a lifetime ago, essentially. I was a completely different person. I wasn't a mother of three that I am now. And it's funny because I feel like that term has come into use here recently. And I was talking with my husband about this a little while ago, about how I really don't identify with that term. You know, and it's funny because I think, okay, well, whenever I think about my own personal identity, I tend to think about, I tend to personally identify more as Hispanic, right? Whereas I know other people who may be of a different geographic region in the United States, or who may even be from a different generation, they may say, well, no, I'm Mexican, you know, even if they weren't born in the country. Or you might have other people who identify more with the term Chicano. Like, I don't know, there's all these different terms that are being used to describe us. And then, but I feel like, you know, we need to be cognizant of that and respectful of that, and allow people to identify themselves as they wish, with full open arms. Because I think that another area where it's highly not talked about is that we, as Hispanics, I think that there's a lot of within group racial inequity that also exists. And I think you Esteban really highlighted that very well. You know, I think about people who, you know, I think part of it is again, going back to these systems that have been created. I think that we have systems where we're literally being forced to choose, are we white or are we Black? And I feel like a lot of us, the first time we were faced with that question, we're like, well, I'm neither, right? We're like, I'm Mexican, or I'm Colombian, or I'm Panamanian. And then what if you know, I have friends who are Chinese Panamanian or German Mexican. Like, where do they fall into all of this? Or even, you know, from a Caribbean island where they're like, I don't fit with any of this. And so I think being more inclusive, even within our own understanding of what it means to be of Hispanic origin, as these, you know, questionnaires in our census that is due here, you know, in a week. I think that it's important to be sensitive to that, and to recognize that, again, language matters, and we need to not perpetuate our own problems we've got enough to deal with everybody else thinking and judging and creating barriers for ourselves, that we don't need to judge each other within our own group.
I think identity is in a whole other conversation and a whole other panel that we could have, and a very important one, because many times these identities are placed on us. I remember when I got to Rice, everyone was using the term Hispanic or Latina, and I was like, no, I'm Mexican. And so it was also like one of those conversations with myself, and with the years I've been able to take some of those terms and know that there's different identities, and then you bring in the intersectionality of, you know, kind of our lives, and I think it's really important for us to have the respect to others, and really let each one of us kind of decide what we identify as, but also know that we're a community, that we're here for each other. And I hope that we can continue having these conversations, that we're able to have more posts like this, that we're able to one day meet in person and have these conversations at Rice and then in other spaces. And I really want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was great to hear from this amazing group of panelists, and thank you for your questions. There's a couple of things that I did want to mention before we head out, and it's the election. So the election is 40 days away, and we know that there's a lot in stake with this election, through COVID-19, through the racial inequities that we're facing, through the struggle that the Black community is facing, through the police brutality, to the income inequality, and so many other issues. And so if you're able to vote, we highly encourage you to register to vote. The October 5th is the registration deadline for voting here in Texas. Early voting here in Texas starts the 13th and goes all the way to the 30th. And then we have the November 3rd And then Olivia mentioned this earlier, and thank you for doing so, but voting down that ticket line, it is so important, y'all, to do that. Yesterday, I went on a rant to my students, and they were like, no, like, I don't want to vote. Like, all those choices suck. And I'm like, no, y'all, like, this is not, like, we can't take that attitude right now. And I was trying to, like, work with them and have them see the importance of that ticket. And so I encourage you to do the same. You know, our local elections really, really, really affect us in our everyday lives, and so we highly encourage you to register to vote. If you're able to, and to encourage others to do so as well. We also encourage you to join Solar for our alumni. Fernanda will be sending her information on the chat box, and so reach out to her if you want to get more involved. It's been a great way to connect with alumni, and I highly encourage you to do so. For undergrads who are, you know, still, you know, at Rice and you know, working toward that degree, stay in contact with us, join Solar, you know, once you graduate, and we really hope that we can kind of have more of these conversations. And then lastly, we also have another event on Friday that we're partnering up with ACER. It's a trivia night at 7:30. It's also through Zoom, so you can register. So we encourage y'all to join us for that, for some community time and just to get to know each other. And that's also Hernandez being wonderful and sending that information as well. And then last, thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Thank you to Fernanda for kind of facilitating this connection with the Office of Multicultural Affairs, for the Office of Multicultural Affairs setting this up, as well as Alumni Relations. And you know, thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, have a wonderful afternoon. And I really appreciated all of your time, all of you spending this time with us. I saw that Angie just logged in, so I don't know, Angie, if you want to share anything before we go. I don't want to put you in the spot.
No, you're good. I unfortunately had to miss the main highlight of the night and hearing our panelists speak, but I look forward to getting the playback from the panelists and from our moderator. But thank you so much for joining, you guys. I'm sure that Mirna gave our upcoming election spiel and why it's so important that we continue to engage at all levels and, you know, using our personal time and our professional time. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. It was an honor to participate.
Incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.